Welcome, dear listener, wherever you are tonight, wrapped in blankets or quietly resting your eyes. Thank you for being here. There's nothing to do now but breathe deeply and listen. Tonight, we step into a world long past, a world where life was hard and quiet, where survival meant endless labor and silence, where a woman's days were filled with work no one saw and a voice no one heard. This is not a story of kings or battles. It is softer, yet no less brutal. It is a story of a woman, a wife, a mother, a servant, living in the shadows of medieval life, bound by duty, unseen and unheard. So let go of your day, let the stillness settle around you, and walk with me now into the hidden, harsh rhythms of her life. This is the harsh reality of women's lives in the Middle Ages. The world did not pause when she was born. No bells rang. No midwife whispered blessings that would carry through history, and no records were carefully inked into books that chronicled legacies or inheritance. She was not a son, and in the Middle Ages, that fact alone shaped the rest of her life before she had ever taken her first breath. In a small wooden room, with straw pushed into corners to soak up what little could be controlled, a girl came into the world with nothing but the weight of expectations already stacked upon her tiny form. Her mother was exhausted, her father quiet, and the neighbors murmured only mildly. A daughter, another mouth, another future to marry off, to manage, to keep hidden when needed and displayed when convenient. From the very beginning, her worth was a calculation, not of who she was or what she could become, but of who she might marry, what she might bring in dowry, how obedient she might remain. In peasant villages, noble courts, and even religious houses, girls were viewed as vessels, for lineage, for labor, for modesty, for burden. The cloth they were wrapped in at birth was not chosen for softness, but simplicity. It had to be washed, reused, handed down. There was no celebration. Her birth was met not with wonder, but with practicality. As she grew, there were few illusions. A little girl might be sung to quietly or taught to whisper prayers in the early dawn, but those tender moments were wrapped tightly around instructions. Keep your eyes lowered. Speak only when asked. Always yield. Yield to your father, to your brother, to the priest, to the world. Yielding was a form of survival. The world outside would not ask her if she was ready. It would simply expect her to follow. There was no school, not in any formal sense. A noble daughter might be taught letters, so she could read scripture, or enough French to write a letter on behalf of her husband one day. But for most girls, knowledge was learned by watching. The way their mothers knelt to scrub floors, how they mended clothes in silence, how they bore their husband's anger with bowed heads. If she was lucky, she might learn songs. If she was unlucky, she'd learn when to hide from the noise behind the door. And still, in those early years, there was a kind of softness. Childhood, in any age, has a way of finding cracks in even the harshest walls. She might chase chickens for fun, pluck a daisy from the grass, laugh when her brother tripped. But even those small joys were often shadowed. If she scraped her knees, she was told to hush. If she was too loud, someone would remind her, a girl should be quiet. If she asked why, she'd be told simply, because that's the way it is. That was the phrase that built her world. That's the way it is. It explained why she couldn't run too far, why she couldn't speak too freely, why her body wasn't hers, why her future had already been decided. In the rare event her mother tried to explain it to her, perhaps late at night, while brushing the child's hair with tired hands, it wasn't with rebellion in her voice, but weariness. Her mother had lived the same truth. Her grandmother before that. There was no room for dreams in this inheritance, only endurance. Generations of women had been born, bowed, and buried under the same sky, and very little had changed for them, save for the names they were called and the men they answered to. The church did not help her find her voice. Instead, it taught her that her voice was a danger. That Eve's mistake had stained every woman to come after, and so humility was her salvation. She was taught that purity was her worth, that suffering made her holy, and that obedience was love. She learned of saints who died for virtue, of wives who wept in silence, of widows who threw themselves into prayer. And though she did not understand all at first, the message was clear. To be good was to be quiet, and to be quiet was to survive. By the time she reached the age of 8 or 9, her world had already narrowed. She helped in the kitchen, scrubbed the floor with lime water, tended to smaller siblings, and prepared to be handed over. Sometimes she watched her brothers play outside while she sat stitching, not because she wanted to, but because she had been told to. She did not ask why anymore. When strangers came to visit, she was expected to smile, to pour ale carefully, to curtsy without wobbling. Already, her posture mattered. Her silence mattered. She had been told, perhaps gently, perhaps not, that a good girl brought pride to her father, and a bad one brought shame. The line between those two fates was thin and constantly shifting. Some nights, when the wind pressed through the cracks in the wooden walls and the candles burned low, she might have wondered if her life could be more than this. But she did not say it aloud, not even to herself, because even the thought of wanting more choice, more voice, more freedom, felt dangerous. And so she curled into herself, wrapped in the same silence her mother had worn, and the same silence her daughter might one day inherit. Because in the Middle Ages, to be born a girl was to be born into powerlessness. And from that moment forward, everything, every rule, every whisper, every glance would remind her of it. And so, she was raised in silence. Not the peaceful kind that falls over fields at dusk or lingers after a lullaby, but the kind of silence shaped by rules, rehearsed glances, and the deep, dull throb of submission passed quietly from one generation of women to the next. Her world became smaller with each passing year, not because the walls of her home moved, but because the invisible expectations that surrounded her grew taller, thicker, and harder to slip past without punishment or shame. There were sounds, of course. The clatter of bowls in the morning, the cough of livestock in the yard, the muttered prayers from her mother before dawn. But within those sounds, her voice rarely joined. She was spoken to more than she was spoken with, and she was corrected far more often than she was asked. Don't speak out of turn. Don't answer back. A quiet girl is a good girl. These weren't shouted. They were simply woven into daily life, as natural as pulling on her shoes or tying her apron. From the moment she could understand words, she was taught how to disappear in plain sight. If guests came, she curtsied and stepped aside. If her father was tired or angry or simply breathing too heavily, she knew to make herself scarce. Her laughter, when it came, was something she learned to muffle, behind her hand, behind a door, behind the quiet fear that being too visible could be mistaken for being too bold. She watched her mother move through rooms like a shadow, always working, always tending, but never taking up space. Even her footsteps were soft, trained not to echo, not to disturb. The only time her mother's voice ever rose above a whisper was when something had gone terribly wrong. A spilled pot, a missing item, a guest arriving unannounced. And even then, her raised voice came with sharpness that wasn't anger so much as fear. Fear of failing, of being punished, of being seen as less than perfect in a world that did not allow women to make mistakes without consequence. Sometimes, she tried to ask questions. Why must she wear a head covering in the chapel when the boys did not? Why could her brothers leave the house alone, while she was told to stay close to the hearth? Why did her value depend so heavily on how others saw her, rather than who she actually was? The answers, when they came, were vague, because that's the way of things. Because the Lord wills it. Because it's not for us to question. The finality of those responses taught her more than the words themselves ever could. She learned that curiosity, in a girl, was seen as impertinent, that intelligence had to be disguised as modesty. That confidence could easily be mistaken for insolence, and insolence for a girl was dangerous. Even among other women, there was little comfort. Older girls passed on lessons with quiet warnings. How to avoid a father's anger, how to hide a bruise, how to speak gently even when you were boiling inside. There was no open rebellion, only strategies for survival. The rare moments of whispered honesty between girls were like candle flames in the wind, precious, brief, and always at risk of being extinguished by a listening ear. The church, which should have offered comfort, instead pressed the silence further. She learned about Eve, whose single act of defiance had brought suffering into the world. About Mary, whose virtue was in her purity, her obedience, her quiet acceptance. The holy women were the silent ones, the ones who bowed their heads and endured. The message was not subtle. To be good was to accept. To be holy was to disappear. She learned to write her name only because her mother had once been allowed to learn. But even that knowledge was kept quiet, hidden, used only in private. There was no future where she might use it freely. Her thoughts, if she dared put them on parchment, were for her eyes only, and even then, she sometimes tore them up, afraid of what they might reveal. By the time she entered adolescence, her silence had become second nature. She walked with her eyes down, her hands folded, her voice measured. She had learned how to answer without speaking, how to agree without believing, how to smile without feeling safe. Her body was changing, and with it came more rules. Walk slower, sit straighter, don't look men in the eye, don't draw attention. Her very presence was now something to be policed by others and eventually by herself. In the rare moments when she was alone, truly alone, away from watchful eyes, she sometimes sang, not loudly, never loudly, but just enough to remind herself that her voice existed. She hummed old songs, one she barely remembered her mother humming long ago, before silence became their language. And in those moments, she felt the strange pull of a truth she could not say aloud, that the silence she was raised in was not natural. It had been built, enforced, and repeated, not for her sake, but for the sake of those who fear what a woman might become if she were ever allowed to speak freely. But still, the silence held, and each day she lived within it made it harder to imagine another way. Until one day, the silence was broken, not by her, but by the knock at the door that changed everything. Because soon, she would not be a daughter, but a bride. And in the Middle Ages, that meant the rules would not soften, only sharpen. And so, the knock came, not as thunderous as one might imagine in stories, but quiet, measured, and deliberate. It was not the sound of fate crashing through a door, but of expectation arriving precisely on time. When her father opened it, the girl knew, without needing to hear the words, that something in her life had shifted. Her mother's hands trembled slightly that evening as she kneaded the dough, though she said nothing of consequence. The fire flickered, the shadows stretched along the walls, and the silence in the house changed. It became heavier, more formal, more certain. The talk that followed was not for her ears. She was sent to fetch water, to gather herbs, to check the latch on the barn door, all tasks designed to keep her away from the words being exchanged inside. But she knew. Every girl did. She had seen it happen to her older cousins, her neighbor's daughter, the girl in the next village. One day, she had been a child. The next, she was spoken for. In the Middle Ages, marriages were not born of affection. They were arrangements, contracts, bargains, settlements of land or livestock or coin. A girl's future was a tool to strengthen alliances, to settle disputes, or simply to lighten the financial burden of keeping her. A daughter was expensive to feed and clothe. A wife, by contrast, was someone else's responsibility. The transaction was not always cruel, but it was rarely kind. Love was never assumed. Compatibility was a luxury no one asked about. She was, in the eyes of the men speaking behind the door, a set of qualities to be discussed. Young, fertile, modest, obedient. Her dowry, likely modest, if it existed at all, might include a cow, a few pieces of linen, perhaps a wooden chest if her mother had one to spare. In wealthier homes, the negotiations were far more intricate. Parcels of land, transfer of titles, promises of inheritance. But the essence was always the same. A girl was currency, and she was being spent. She was not told until days later. The announcement came after supper, when the bread was still warm and the sky outside had just begun to darken. Her father's voice was matter-of-fact. Her mother looked away. The name of the man she was to marry meant little to her. A neighbor's son, perhaps, or a farmer from a nearby village. She had seen him before, maybe or maybe not. It hardly mattered. He had been deemed suitable. She was to be his wife. The decision was made. There was no question of her consent. No pause to ask if her heart raced with fear, or if her dreams had ever wandered somewhere else. A refusal would not have been accepted. Even tears might have been seen as disrespectful. And so, she bowed her head, the way she had been taught, and nodded. Inside, something dimmed. The days that followed were a blur of preparation. Her mother helped sew a new tunic, careful not to waste fabric. Her siblings watched her with curiosity, as if trying to understand how someone could change from girl to bride in the span of a week. She was coached on how to behave, how to pour ale gracefully, how to keep her eyes low during the ceremony, how to answer without seeming impertinent. She was told what to expect on her wedding night, but not in words that offered comfort, only in hints, warnings, and half-finished sentences that left her with more dread than knowledge. In noble households, the process was far grander but no less transactional. Girls as young as 12 were promised to men twice their age. The wedding might come later, but the bond was already sealed. Families hosted feasts, arranged dowries worth entire farms, and displayed their daughters like polished silver. But even in silken gowns and jeweled veils, the truth remained. She was not choosing her future. It had been chosen for her. On the morning of her wedding, the air felt different. The sky was gray, or perhaps blue. It no longer mattered. Everything she did felt like something she might never do again. She washed her hands slowly, tied her hair with trembling fingers, ate bread she could not taste. When the time came, she walked to the chapel beside her father, her feet heavy on the dirt path, her face carefully composed. Inside the stone walls of the chapel, with its worn floor and smoke-blackened beams, she stood beside a man she barely knew. The priest spoke, Latin words she could not understand, vows that seemed less about love and more about duty. She said yes when prompted. So did he? A ring, or perhaps just a clasp of hands, sealed it. And just like that, she was no longer a daughter. She was a wife, a possession transferred. The wedding feast was small. Neighbors smiled. Ale was shared. Bread and broth passed around. She smiled too, though her heart was tight in her chest. Her husband's hand on her back was heavy. The laughter around her was distant, muffled, unreal. She felt as though she had stepped outside of herself, watching a life unfold that was hers in name only. That night, in a room not her own, beside a man she did not love, she learned what her silence had prepared her for. There was no cruelty, perhaps, but no tenderness either. Just expectation, just ownership, just the quiet, brutal reality of a girl raised to obey, now fulfilling her role. In the morning, no one asked how she felt. Instead, they asked if the sheets were stained, proof of her virginity, proof of her worth. She was now fully wed, fully transferred, fully bound. The days that followed blurred together. Cooking, cleaning, learning her husband's moods, adjusting to a new rhythm of life that demanded more and offered less. She missed her siblings, missed the garden behind her parents' house, missed a version of herself that had still believed she might one day choose. But even as she mourned, she did not rebel. She had been traded, and trades were final. Yet beneath the obedience, something stirred, a quiet realization that though her life was no longer hers, her thoughts still were. And though her body had been given away, her memories belonged only to her. And so, she began to store them. The sound of her sister's laugh, the warmth of the bread her mother used to bake, the feeling of grass beneath bare feet. Small things, secret things, the beginnings of something fragile and defiant. But that would come later. For now, she had been traded. And what came next was learning how to survive in the hands of a man who believed she was his. In name, in duty, and in silence. The villagers called it a wedding, but to her, it felt more like a play she had watched from within. Present, dressed, spoken for, yet never once invited to choose a line. The morning after, as the low sun cast long shadows over the misty rooftops and a cock crowed from somewhere out in the fields, she sat alone at the edge of the straw-stuffed mattress, hands folded in her lap, and wondered what had actually happened. It was not the ceremony itself that disturbed her, though the coldness of it lingered, but the peculiar emptiness she felt inside. Not grief, exactly, not anger, just a hollowness, as if something had been scooped out of her, and no one thought to ask what it was. People had smiled. They always did at weddings. Ale had been poured, songs half sung, and someone had even lifted fiddle. A cousin pinched her cheek with drunken fondness. Her father clapped the groom on the back. Her mother stiff with worry and ritual, pass around salted bread, and try to make her eyes not betray her weariness. The neighbors had nodded and muttered blessings. To them, it had all been as it should be. A girl given, a man gained, a future secured. But to her, the wedding had not been hers. It had belonged to them, the watchers, the arrangers, the beneficiaries of her obedience. She had been dressed in linen, not chosen by her. Her hair braided by hands not her own. Words spoken for her. Promises she was told she would one day grow into. Even the smile she wore was borrowed, stitched onto her face because everyone expected to see it, not because she felt it. And when the night came and the candles burned low and the wine dulled the sound of celebration, she was led into a room as if to her own coronation. But what was being crowned was not joy, but submission. She became his wife not by love or mutual vow, but by fulfillment of a transaction centuries old, practiced 1,000 times in 1,000 villages. There had been no music that echoed in her heart, no vow that felt like a promise meant for her soul, no moment of shared breath, or whispered truth exchanged when no one else was looking. What there had been was a weight of the room pressing it on her, the roughness of his touch, not violent, but unfamiliar, uncaring, and a terrible knowledge that from this night forward her life was bound to a man she barely knew, by laws written without her consent, enforced by custom older than memory. The next morning, her husband rose early, scratching his beard and muttering about firewood. He dressed with the ease of someone returning to routine. She watched him from a corner of the room, wondering how he had made peace with this life. Perhaps he hadn't needed to. A man in the Middle Ages did not question the marriage bed. He did not wait for love. He did not seek permission. He was taught that a wife was his, in the same way that a field was plowed, a goat milked, or a debt collected. She had been taught to accept this, to be grateful. After all, her husband had not been cruel. He had not struck her. He had not demanded more than the ritual. He had fulfilled his duty and now expected her to do the same. For many, that was enough. More than some, perhaps, but she could not help the weight in her chest, the quiet mourning for something unnamed, a sense that even if she could not have chosen love, she might have at least chosen kindness. Or time, but there was no time. Life was urgent in the Middle Ages. Crops had to be planted, animals tended, homes repaired before rain, and frost made work twice as hard. Her wedding was already old news. She was now a wife, and wives had roles to play. Within days, she had been absorbed into the rhythms of her new household. Rise before the sun, stoke the fire, bake the bread, mend the clothes, tend the garden, clean the floor, smile when spoken to, lower your gaze, make yourself useful. Sometimes her hands worked faster than her thoughts, and in that strange stillness between movements, memories of the wedding surfaced again. Not the celebration, but the detachment. She remembered standing in front of the priest, eyes fixed on a wooden crucifix that hung askew on the wall, wondering whether the Virgin Mary had felt as invisible as she did, whether any saint had ever been asked to smile through a ritual that gave them no say. Her husband began referring to her not by name, but with soft commands. Wife, bring me ale. Wife, fetch the spade. It was not cruel, not even cold, simply practical, expected. In his eyes, the wedding had been a passage, and now she was his helper, his housekeeper, and in time, the mother of his children. He did not know her thoughts, nor did he wish to. That was not the role of a wife. Her silence meant harmony. Her obedience meant peace. These were virtues, not shackles, or so she had been told. She tried not to resent him. He had, after all, been raised the same way. He, too, had been told what to want. A wife who worked hard, did not complain, and bore children. Love was for songs and fools. But late at night, when the coals died down and the wind rattled through the shutters, she sometimes turned her face toward the wall and let herself imagine what a real wedding might have been like. One where she was not the object of exchange, but a person at the center. One where her voice had been heard. One where the vows had come not from duty, but from knowing, truly knowing, that this was what she wanted. But that was not her story. Her wedding had passed, and in its place, there was a new kind of silence. Not the silence of a daughter unseen, but the silence of a woman now claimed. Still, Deep within that silence, something remained, a sliver of awareness that what she had been given was not a life, but a role, and that one day, that role might press too hard against the soul still hidden underneath. And so, the days became labor, not the celebrated labor creation or craft, but the invisible, unrelenting work of being needed in all the wrong ways. As a wife, she did not own a field, yet she bent her back beside the men in planting season. She did not sit in council, yet her hands held together the household with thread and salt and ash. She was no lord, no leader, no one of name or legacy, but the rhythm of life, her husband's comfort, the warmth of meals, the care of children yet to be born, these rested silently on her shoulders. There was no start or end to her work, no bell that marked her labor, no pause between duty and rest. Morning began not with light, but with movement. The silent slipping out of bed to feed the fire before it died, to bake the bread before hunger stirred the house, to sweep the hearth before anyone noticed its soot. And night did not bring peace but preparation. Washing garments by firelight, boiling herbs for illness, mending tools that no one else had time for. Every motion was expected, not praised, not acknowledged. The reward for her toil was the absence of complaint. The quiet assumption that all was in its place because she had kept it there. The floor was swept because she swept it. The stew was thick because she stirred it. The clothes were patched because she sat hunched over coarse linen when the moon had risen. Her husband never asked how her hands felt, calloused as they were from cold water and rough stone. He did not ask if her back ached from lifting or if her feet throbbed from standing. These were not the concerns of men. But she noticed. She noticed her hands aging before her face did. She noticed the way the skin around her knuckles cracked in winter, the way her breath shortened in the damp cellar, the way her shoulders curved inwards from years of bending. She did not say these things aloud. To complain was to be ungrateful, and a wife had no right to wear her exhaustion. The labor was not always brutal, in the way that war is brutal, or illness. It was brutal in its permanence, its invisibility, its inescapable demand. It was a kind of work that never proved itself finished, because as soon as one task was done, another took its place. The stew would be eaten, the floor dirted again. The children, when they came, would grow, and with growth came more washing, more tending, more sleepless nights. The wheel turned, and she turned with it. Even the seasons brought no relief. In winter, the cold stiffened her joints, and water had to be broken before it could be carried. In spring, mud made the yard mire, and yet the garden needed planting. In summer, the air stifled and flies buzzed in the pantry, and still the bread must rise, the herbs be hung, the wool be cleaned. Autumn was harvest, and though her hands would never hold the scales at market, they would have held every bundle of barley and sack of grain along the way. There were no holidays for her. Church days were not rest days. They were simply different work, dressing the children, preparing a finer meal, walking in shoes that pinched. Even feasts required hours of labor in advance, hours spent slaughtering hens, grinding flour, stuffing onions. Celebration was a performance she helped produce, but never paused long enough to enjoy. Her husband worked too, of course, plowing, harvesting, repairing, but when his work ended, it ended. He sat, he drank, he slept, she worked around him, through him, for him. There was never a time when her hands were not asked for something, and yet, in the eyes of the world, she did nothing important. She was not the plowman who fed the village. She was not the priest who blessed the dead. She was not the blacksmith who shaped the world in fire. She was not even the midwife who ushered life and death with equal calm. She was the wife, a background role, a servant without a wage, a machine powered by duty. What little pleasure she found came in moments stolen. The smell of yeast as bread rose in a warm bowl, the flicker of candlelight dancing on the ceiling, the brief quiet when the house finally stilled, and her body could melt into the worn curve of the bed. These were small mercies, not enough to satisfy, but enough to continue. Sometimes she dreamed, though not in the way children dream of castles or magic. Her dreams were simpler, that her hands might be still, that someone might ask how she was, and wait for the answer, that her name might be remembered not as wife of this man or mother of that child, but simply as herself. She did not expect thanks. She did not seek praise. But she wished, perhaps, that someone might understand the toll of a life lived entirely in service. That someone might say, even once, "I see you," and mean it, but no one did. And so she worked, because if she stopped, everything would fall apart. And if she broke, someone would say she was weak. Never once would they say she was exhausted. And still, amidst all the labor, all the silence, all the bending and mending and sweeping and serving, there came the next inevitability. The swelling of her belly, the tightening of her bodice, the subtle shifting of glances as neighbors began to smile knowingly. It did not take long. A wife was expected to bear children quickly. Her womb was not her own. It was a chamber of duty, a vessel for lineage, a space where silence became flesh. And when the signs arrived, the late moon, the aching breast, the sudden sickness in the morning, she said nothing at first, not because she was uncertain, but because she knew exactly what was coming. The knowledge did not bring joy. There was no celebration, no tender announcement, just a quiet acknowledgement between husband and wife, a grunt of approval perhaps, and then the subtle shifting of expectations. She was no longer just a wife. Now, she was a mother in waiting. Her movement slowed. Her sleep worsened. Her tasks, though never reduced, changed in rhythm. She was still expected to rise early, but now with swollen ankles. Still expected to carry water, though the pail felt heavier each week. Still expected to cook, to mend, to serve, all while something inside her grew, pressed, took from her bones and blood. In the quiet moments, she would touch her belly and wonder, not what the child would be. She had no fantasies of lullabies or painted cradles, but whether she would survive. Childbirth in the Middle Ages was not a passage into joy, but a gamble with death. Women knew this. They whispered it in corners, passed stories in hushed tones, of the girl from the next village who bled for 3 days before passing, of the mother who lost her 3rd child in her life on the same night, of the widow with 6 children and no voice left from screaming. These were not tragedies. They were expectations. There were no doctors, not for women like her. There was no clean linen, no sterile blade, no pain relief, no guarantee. The midwife was the closest thing to salvation. An older woman, often as worn by life as her patients, her hands rough, her knowledge passed down through practice, not books. She came with herbs, cloth, warm water, and the quiet authority of someone who had seen too much. But even she could do little when things went wrong. And so, as the months crept forward, the woman worked with strange, hollow focus, her body already aching, her breath shortening, her skin stretching with every step. Her husband grew more distant, as if her changing shape reminded him of something uncomfortable. He offered no comfort, no affection, no fear. It was not his risk. After all, he had done his part. Now he waited. When the time came, it came without ceremony. Her water broke silently in the pre-dawn chill, a rush of warmth against her thighs that made her freeze in place, hand gripping the edge of the table. There was no time for panic. She called for the neighbor boy, told him to run for the midwife. The pain followed, quickly, harshly, like waves crashing through her spine. She had known it would hurt. Everyone said it did, but she had not expected it to feel like being torn open from within. The midwife arrived before sunrise, her breath misting in the cold air, her expression unreadable. She set to work without pleasantries, spreading cloth on the floor, boiling water over the hearth, muttering instructions to the husband, who stood awkwardly in the doorway and then vanished. He would not watch. Men did not attend births. Blood and pain were for women to endure alone. For hours she labored. The pain was endless. There was no break between contractions, only variations in agony. She screamed until her throat tore, then moaned when screaming took too much strength. The midwife pressed her knees apart, pushed on her belly, whispered prayers under her breath. There was blood. Too much, perhaps. There was sweat, tears, the sour stench of fear. At one point, she passed out. When she awoke, it was still not over. Time became a blur. She saw faces that weren't there, heard voices that made no sense. Her body became something separate, not hers, but a thing trapped in torment, twisting, tearing, trying to make space for life. And then, finally, with one long, guttural cry, the child came. It was a boy. The midwife said so without expression. The umbilical cord was cut with a knife that had been heated in the fire. The child was wiped down, wrapped in linen, placed aside. No one placed him in her arms. She was still bleeding. The afterbirth came next, and it was worse than she expected. Not because of the pain, but because of the shaking. Her body was cold. Her teeth chattered. She could not lift her head. The midwife pressed cloth between her legs, muttered something about stopping the flow. She did not die. Not this time. But something inside her felt permanently altered. The child was alive. She had done her duty. And yet there was no celebration. Just quiet, exhaustion, relief that she was not one of the ones who didn't wake up. In the days that followed, her recovery was swift only in name. There was no rest, no lying in. By the third day, she was up again, feeding the fire, washing the child, nursing until her nipples cracked. Her husband expected meals. Her older children, if she had any, still needed tending. Life had no patience for weakness. The world kept moving. She looked at the child, and yes, there was love, or at least something like it. A flicker of protectiveness. A sense that this tiny thing, so helpless, was hers in a way that no other part of her life had ever been. But the love did not erase the pain. It did not undo the fear. It did not erase the knowledge that, should she fall pregnant again, she might not be so lucky. And so, she lived, worked, nursed, bled again in time. She did not speak of the pain. No one asked, and though her body bore the scars of life, stretch marks, torn muscles, sagging skin, her worth was measured not by what she had survived, but by how quietly she had endured it. And while the pain of childbirth eventually faded into a dull ache remembered mostly in silence, there remained another wound, deeper than flesh, invisible to the eye, the wound of voicelessness, of being present in a world that did not hear her, did not see her, and certainly did not ask her to speak. The court, whether the Lord's manor or the village council, was not a place for women, not for her kind. Anyway, the peasant, the mother, the wife, there were women of noble birth who might sometimes appear in public, cloaked and proper, but even they rarely held power that was not granted through a man. For most women, the court, as a place of judgment, decision, or justice, was a space they entered only to be silenced. Disputes were heard, fields were divided, punishments assigned, taxes demanded, and all of it occurred in gatherings where only male voices echoed. Even when the issue at hand directly concerned her, a theft from her pantry, a beating too cruel to hide, a piece of land her father once tilled, she could not stand and testify for herself. The word of a woman was worth half or none at all. If she were lucky, her husband would speak on her behalf. If she were not, her silence would be taken as consent, and justice passed her by like wind across a shuttered window. She had heard tales of women who tried, bold souls who dared to speak in their own defense. One had raised her voice in protest when her neighbor accused her of stealing eggs. The court had laughed, not at the charge, but at her audacity. Another, desperate, had interrupted a tax meeting to beg mercy for her starving children. She had been fined for disorder. No one listened. No one wanted to, and so she stayed away. The court was not for her. Even when she was summoned, as all villagers were from time to time, she stood at the edge, eyes lowered, hands clasped, the image of obedience. She did not speak unless addressed. She answered only what was asked. She never interrupted. To do so would invite ridicule, or worse, suspicion. For suspicion was a shadow that always lingered behind female speech. A woman who spoke too much, too clearly, too passionately, was dangerous. She might be a gossip, a witch, a shrew. Her words could spread unrest. Her knowledge could threaten peace. Best, then, that she remain quiet, a vessel of labor, not opinion. And yet, there were times she burned to speak, when her husband's oxen were taxed unfairly and no one protested, when her brother's was dismissed because it named her heir, when her friend was whipped for insolence, though she had only begged for less rent. In those moments, her silence was not just obedience, it was suffocation. She would return home with clenched fists, the unsaid words echoing in her skull, more painful than any sore muscle. It was not that she had no thoughts. Her mind was quick, sharper perhaps than her husband's, honed by a lifetime of reading people, managing households, memorizing cycles and seasons. She understood how things worked, who made the rules, who bent them, who suffered. But her understanding had no outlet. It lived inside her, heavy and restless. Sometimes, she whispered to herself at night, just to hear her voice say something other than yes or I'll get it. She recited prayers not for faith, but for the comfort of speech. She told stories to her children, not just to soothe them, but to remember that she, too, had a mind that created, imagined, questioned. In her own way, she learned to navigate the silence. She influenced without being seen. A suggestion dropped carefully into her husband's ear, shaped just right so that he believed it his own idea. A quiet warning to her son before he joined the wrong group of boys. A gentle shift of plans in the kitchen that avoided offense to the local priest. She played the game, the one all women knew, of guiding without leading, speaking without being heard, shaping the world from the shadows. But even mastery of this quiet art did not protect her from the court's authority. If she were accused of something, theft, slander, impropriety, she would be brought forward, judged without advocacy. She could not plead her case. Her demeanor, her reputation, her husband's standing, these would speak louder than anything she could say. If she were poor, disheveled, unmarried, or simply disliked, her guilt would be assumed, and the punishments, stocks, fines, whippings, were public, humiliating, and sometimes fatal. She knew of one woman who had spoken ill of a landlord's steward, not in court, but in the market, where ears are always sharper than mouths believe. Days later, she was summoned. The charge was sowing unrest. She tried to explain. She had not meant to stir trouble. She had merely spoken the truth. But the court did not care for her truth. They cared for quiet. She was sentenced to wear the scold's bridle, a metal contraption that clamped her mouth shut, pierced her tongue if she tried to speak. She wore it for an hour in the village square, and for years in her soul. And still, women endured. They found each other in corners, by the well, in the fields, at the edge of forest paths. There, they spoke freely, at least for a moment. Not loud, not rebellious. Just honestly, they shared stories, warnings, advice, laughter, even grief. These secret courts, made of whispers and glances, were their true justice. Not perfect, not powerful, but theirs. And when they returned to the world, to the places where their voices meant nothing, they carried those whispered memories like embers, quiet, hidden, but warm. Because even if the court had no place for them, they had not forgotten who they were. Not just wives, not just mothers, not just servants, but women. Silenced, perhaps, but not gone. The world outside her home moved with a rhythm she could no longer hear. The village sun rose and set, seasons turned, and life carried on in its relentless, unyielding way. But behind the wooden door of her small chamber, time folded on itself, and silence held a different weight. It was a kind of silence that pressed against skin and bone, that wrapped tightly around the spaces where words should have lived but never dared to breathe. Behind closed doors, in the dim corners of hearth and shadow, there was a violence that the world beyond pretended did not exist, a cruelty that was as ancient as the walls that enclosed her, as hidden as the bruises she traced with trembling fingers when no one watched. This was not the violence of war, where swords clashed and banners fell, where cries echoed through fields and histories were written in blood and ash. No, this was a quieter suffering, folded beneath daily chores and whispered prayers, endured in the spaces where no law dared enter. It was a violence inflicted not by strangers, but by those who held her life in their hands. A husband, a father, a man who had claimed possession of her body and her will. Behind closed doors, her world was not her own, but a prison constructed of fists and silence, fear and whispered threats. The first blow might come as a sudden flash, a sharp word hurled across a cluttered room, a hand raised too quickly, the sudden snap of anger like thunder breaking a fragile calm. Sometimes it came from frustration, the weight of too many demands, the weariness of a hard life pressing down on the shoulders of men, as well as women. Other times, it was cold and deliberate, a reminder that power was absolute, that her obedience was not optional. The bruises that bloomed beneath her skin were not just pain, but warnings etched in flesh, marks to be hidden beneath layered clothing, behind long sleeves, beneath the thin veil of daily smiles. There was no refuge. The neighbors might glimpse a harsh word, hear a door slammed too hard, but the veil of privacy was sacred, a boundary not crossed. To intervene was to risk anger, to be drawn into disputes that women rarely won and men never lost. The village watched from the outside, nodding at the hard truths of marriage and duty, whispering the curse of temper or the fickleness of women, but rarely questioning the violence itself. Behind closed doors, suffering was private, shameful, and to speak of it was to invite greater pain. She learned quickly the unspoken rules of survival. Never provoke the anger that roared beneath a harsh word. Never meet a raised hand with defiance. Quiet her own voice before it grew too loud. The strength to endure was prized above all else. Strength not to fight back, but to bend and absorb, to make herself small, invisible, forgettable. To survive meant silence. At night, the walls seemed to close in tighter. The flicker of the candle cast long shadows on cracked plaster, and the soft creaks of a settling house became the soundtrack of fear. She lay still, pretending to sleep while the weight of a fist pressed against her back, the whispered curses spilling into her ears like poison. Tears were shed in secret, wiped away with rough cloth, and folded away beneath the heavy quilt that did not warm her heart. In those long hours, she might dream of escape, of freedom beyond the fields and fences, but dawn always brought the same cold light, the same heavy door waiting to be opened. Her body became a map of pain, bruises, scars, the ache of bones that bore the blows not only of violence, but of neglect. There was no doctor's care, no comforting hand. Only the cold water on a rough cloth, the whispered promises of "this too shall pass," spoken to a hollow room. Her suffering was both punishment and proof of endurance, a cruel paradox with the greater her pain, the more her worth was questioned. If she were a better wife, the village said, he would not need to strike. The blame always circled back to her, binding her tighter in a web of shame and silence. Yet even in this darkness, she found moments of fragile light. The small kindness of a neighbor's glance, a loaf of bread left quietly at the door, the soft voice of a child calling her name. These were threads of hope, small reminders that she was not entirely alone. Sometimes, in the briefest moments when a man's fury faded to exhaustion, there was tenderness, a touch that was not violence but care. Those fleeting glimpses of humanity became memories she clung to, islands of warmth in a sea of cold. Over time, the violence shaped more than her body. It shaped her very sense of self. She learned to shrink her needs, to bury her dreams, to cloak her fears beneath a mask of quiet compliance. Her voice, once a spark of curiosity and wonder, was dulled to a whisper, then silence. The woman she might have been was folded away like a worn garment, replaced by one who knew how to survive the storm without breaking. And yet, beneath the layers of fear and pain, something stubborn remained. A flicker of resilience, a memory of a time before the blows, a whisper hope that this was not the only way. It was a part of her that still believed in the possibility of kindness, in the power of her own worth beyond the bruises and the silence. It was a secret ember that might one day grow, quietly, in the darkness behind closed doors. For now, though, she lived in the shadow of violence, in a world that turned away, that whispered of duty and endurance, that called silent strength and suffering honor. Behind closed doors, the brutal truth of her life was written not in chronicles or songs, but in the quiet, unseen spaces where pain and courage intertwined, where a woman survived by bending but never truly breaking. If behind closed doors the bruises marked her body in silence, stifled her voice, outside those walls of demands on her flesh and spirit multiplied, like the ceaseless turning of the seasons. There was no sanctuary, no reprieve, only the endless cadence of labor that shaped every waking moment, every breath, every aching bone. The world beyond the threshold was a harsh and unforgiving place, a land where survival was measured in the weight of bundles carried. to bend the backs under the heavy yoke of responsibility, the callous texture of hands shaped by countless chores performed from dawn's first light to the deepest hour of night. The violence of possession was replaced, but never lessened by the violence of exhaustion, the brutal cost of being needed in all directions at once, but never truly belonging anywhere. The same hands that once trembled in fear behind closed doors now moved with resolute precision in the fields, tending the soil that was neither hers nor promised, working alongside men whose eyes rarely met hers, and whose world was defined by plowshares and cattle, markets and taxes. Though she held no title, no ownership, no voice in the decisions made at the Lord's manor or the village council, the life of the entire household rested on her ability to coax growth in the earth, to gather the harvest, to carry the weight of sustenance on arms weary from abuse and endless work. In planting season, when the soil was soft and the air smelled of damp earth and new beginnings, she rose before the sun, her steps muffled on the frost-hardened path as she moved to stoke the fire that would bake the bread, to fill the wooden buckets that would quench the thirst of animals and family alike. She bent low to plant seed after seed, her knees sinking in the mud that swallowed shoes and made every movement a slow struggle. Her back curved from the constant stooping, her fingers raw from gripping rough tools that seemed designed to punish rather than aid. The men with their oxen and plows moved with booming strength and pride. She moved with silent determination, the steady pulse of life itself. Yet the field was only one stage of her ceaseless toil. When the sun climbed high, beating down with relentless heat or chilling rains that soaked her through, she would return to the hearth, where the hard work of house and home awaited, stirring thick stews over smoky fires, mending clothes patched so many times they were threadbare, washing linens by hand in cold water drawn from wells that tasted of iron and stone. The walls of the cottage echoed with the scrape of broom on floor, the clatter of wooden churns, the whisper of children's cries and laughter tangled with scolding. Every corner demanded attention. Every task a new thread in the web of survival she wove daily. Her hands, bruised and cracked from winter's bite and summer's toil, knew no rest. She milked goats with steady fingers, careful not to spill a drop, fed chickens and gathered eggs with practiced ease, churned butter and dried herbs, tended the garden beds where wildflowers and vegetables struggled for life in poor soil. Her eyes, dull with fatigue but sharp with vigilance, watched over the children whose small fingers clutched hers in moments of fleeting tenderness, whose futures were as uncertain as the shifting skies. And still, there was no praise, no gratitude beyond the barest acknowledgement that the household did not collapse. Her husband, when he returned from his labors, sank into his chair and drank ale, spoke little but expected much. A hot meal, clean clothes, the quiet submission that marked a good wife. The neighbors nodded to him with respect, but to her, with a glance of passing pity or dismissal. She was the background, the silent current beneath their louder stories and wider histories. The seasons turned, relentless and indifferent, cycling to the same unyielding demands. Winter brought frozen hands and icy dawns, when water cracked beneath her fingers and the smoke on the hearth curled like a fragile lifeline to the cold sky. Spring pressed forward with muddy fields and the hopeful task of planting anew, even as her body ached from the previous year's labors. Summer was stifling and loud with buzzing flies, the garden's bounty barely enough to fill the gaps of hunger that crept beneath the skin. Autumn was harvest. Long days bending under baskets heavy with grain, sweat mixing with dirt and tears she never allowed herself to shed. Amid this endless work, the memory of the violence behind closed doors was never far, a dull ache in her limbs, a tension in her shoulders that no amount of physical exhaustion could release. Her strength was tested daily, and sometimes broken but never surrendered. She bore the burden of her home like the cracked stones that paved the village path. Steady, unyielding, worn by time but never shattered. There was no day without labor, no hour without duty, no moment truly her own. The world demanded she move, feed, mend, serve, and she did. Because if she did not, the fragile balance of their existence would crumble. The children would go hungry, the animals would starve, the house would fall to ruin. And so, even when her body screamed for rest, when her eyes grew heavy and her heart ached for something beyond survival, she rose again. Yet within this relentless toil, there was a rhythm, harsh, unyielding, but hers to hold. In the quiet moments before dawn, when the village slept and the earth smelled of promise, she might catch a breath, a fleeting sense of herself beneath the layers of labor and pain. The warm flour dusting her hands, the sharp scent of fresh herbs, the soft cooing of a child. These small mercies carried her through. Her story was not sung in the grand halls of kings, nor written in the scrolls of scholars. It was etched in the calluses of her hands, the weariness of her frame, the quiet endurance of a woman who gave all she had and kept going. The brutal reality of her life was survival, the endless cycle of work, the invisible strength that bore the weight of a world built on the backs of women like her, the silent fight that was waged not with swords, but with persistence. And so, in the cold light of dawn, with a heart both heavy and hopeful, she moved again, bending, planting, mending, serving, carrying the life of her family and the history of her people in every step, every breath, every ache. Her toil was the pulse of the village, the invisible thread that held it all together, the quiet testament to a woman's strength in a world that would never truly see her. Beyond the rough-hewn cottages and muddy village lanes, in the high stone keeps and timbered manors of lords and ladies, a different kind of life unfolded, one draped in silks and velvet, echoing with the soft clatter of servants' footsteps and the measured tones of courtly etiquette, yet no less a prison for the women who inhabited it. The noble woman, often imagined as a figure of luxury and power, lived within a cage woven not of iron bars, but of expectation, duty, and isolation, gilded confines that shaped every breath she took, every word she uttered, every step she was allowed to make. Though her life was far removed from the brutal labor and relentless survival of the peasant woman, it was nonetheless dictated by rules that left little room for freedom or true selfhood, a daily performance choreographed by birthright, marriage contracts, and the insatiable demands of lineage. From childhood, a noble girl's days were regimented and purposeful, crafted not to nurture her desires, but to prepare her for a future of alliances and appearances. She was trained in needlework, reading, and the art of graceful speech, skills prized not for their own sake, but as tools to secure her family's standing, to attract a husband worthy of her name. Play was measured and polite, laughter was tempered by decorum, and every interaction was a rehearsal for a life where a primary role would be to bear heirs, manage a household the size of a village, and represent a family in a world where power was wielded through marriage as much as through swords. The noblewoman's home was a sprawling fortress, its walls thick with history and secrets, its corridors echoing with whispers and footfalls. Yet within those stone halls, she was often alone, separated from the bustle of common folk, kept distant from the freedoms of the outside world, her movements watched by servants and spies alike. Her company was carefully selected. Tutors who instructed her in languages and manners, ladies-in-waiting who served as companions but also monitors, and family members who weighed her every action against the family's honor. There was little room for spontaneous joy or reckless dreams. Her existence was a series of duties, each one a brick in a cage that would hold her until death or marriage released her. Marriage was the ultimate transaction, a binding contract that connected families and secured alliances. The noble woman, sometimes barely more than a child herself, was promised to a man she might never meet until the day of their wedding. Her dowry was a treasure trove of lands, jewels, and wealth, assets that boasted the status of both families but offered her no agency in the matter. The wedding itself was a grand spectacle, a public display of power and prestige, but behind the ornate gowns and elaborate ceremonies lay a stark truth. The noble woman was an object to be possessed, a prize to be exchanged in a complex game of medieval politics. Once married, her days settled into a rigid pattern of expectations and responsibilities that left her little time for herself. She was mistress of a household that could rival a village in size, charged with managing servants, overseeing supplies, and ensuring the smooth running of every aspect of daily life. Her decisions impacted the lives of dozens, yet her voice was often mediated by the men around her, her husband, her father-in-law, her brothers. Even in power, she remained bound by the expectations of obedience and subservience, her authority circumscribed by the very laws and customs that place her on a pedestal. Social isolation was a constant companion. Visits from other noble families were formal affairs, structured by etiquette and expectation rather than warmth or friendship. Her time was segmented into prayers, meals, embroidery, and overseeing the education of her children. each act another link in a chain that held her in place. Leisure, when it came, was rarely spontaneous or private. The grand halls echoed with music and dance, but even then, she was a performer, her smiles and gestures rehearsed, her laughter measured to please an audience that was always watching. The noblewoman's body, too, bore the burdens of her role. She was expected to produce heirs, sons to inherit lands, titles, and power. Pregnancy was not a matter of personal joy or choice, but a duty etched into her very flesh. She endured the pains and dangers of childbirth with little support beyond midwives and whispered prayers, her health and life secondary to the continuation of bloodlines. Illness was often treated with the remedies of the time, herbs and rituals, but also with suspicion and fear, as any sign of weakness could threaten her position or invite gossip. And yet, within this gilded cage, the noble woman cultivated a quiet resilience. She learned to wield the limited power she had with subtlety and skill, influencing decisions through whispered counsel, coded glances, and alliances forged in the shadowed corners of the great halls. She understood the game of survival in a world where her value was tied to beauty, fertility, and obedience, and she played her part with a mixture of grace and guarded defiance. Her thoughts, desires, and fears were often hidden beneath layers of silk and etiquette, but they existed. Fragile as spring blossoms, persistent as a slow drip of water on stone. In the privacy of her chamber, she might allow herself a moment of sorrow or longing, a stolen glance at a letter from a distant friend, a whispered prayer for freedom, a silent tear for a life lived in quiet captivity. The noblewoman's cage was one of privilege, yes, but also of sacrifice. Her life was a constant negotiation between power and powerlessness, visibility and invisibility, duty and desire. And while the world outside might envy her riches and status, few understood the loneliness that came with them, the isolation, the strictures, the knowledge that every choice was made for her before she was old enough to speak. In the end, whether wrapped in coarse linen or silken brocade, the story was the same: a woman bound by expectation, confined by custom, silenced by tradition, yet enduring in ways both seen and unseen. The noblewoman's cage was not built of stone alone. It was crafted from the relentless weight of roles she was born into and the quiet strength she summoned to live within them. In the vast tapestry of medieval life, stretching across fields and forests, castles and villages, there loomed an institution whose shadow stretched deepest into the hearts and minds of all, yet most profoundly upon women, whose lives were shaped, judged, and bound by the relentless doctrine of the Church. The Church was not merely a place of worship, but a force that governed morality, dictated social order, and defined the essence of what it meant to be a woman. It was a power that spoke in voices soft as a prayer and sharp as a judgment, weaving sin and virtue into a web from which few women could escape. From the moment of baptism, a girl's soul was marked as sacred yet vulnerable, destined to be both a vessel of purity and a battleground of temptation. The Church's teachings held up ideals so impossible they seemed to hover just beyond reach. Chastity before marriage, fidelity within it, obedience to husband and God alike, humility, and self-sacrifice as virtues to aspire to, sins to avoid at all costs. A woman's worth, the clergy proclaimed, was measured less by her deeds and by the invisible state of her soul, weighed daily on scales only heaven could see. The pulpit preached fire and brimstone, reminding women of Eve's fall, the original sin that cast humanity into corruption, and through which, according to doctrine, women inherited a special burden: the curse of temptation, the weakness of flesh, the danger of desire. This narrative was repeated endlessly in sermons, prayers, and confessions, shaping not only how men viewed women, but how women viewed themselves. To be a woman was to be perpetually suspect, a creature of both beauty and peril, whose purity was fragile and whose sinfulness was easily awakened. The impossible ideal of virginity became the cornerstone of a girl's value, a symbol of honor not just for herself but for her entire family, a commodity to be protected with vigilance as precious as gold. Mothers counseled daughters in hushed tones about modesty, the dangers of the gaze, the necessity of keeping hands and eyes lowered. Songs and stories filled with warnings were whispered like spells. The fate of those who strayed was swift and merciless. To lose one's virginity outside the sacred bounds of marriage was not merely a personal failing. It was a stain on lineage, a threat to social order, a sin that demanded punishment. Marriage, then, was framed not only as a social contract, but as a spiritual covenant, a woman's sanctified duty to submit to her husband's authority and bear children in accordance with divine will. Yet even within marriage, the ideal of purity remained, now transformed into the expectation of fidelity and moral rectitude, enforced not only by law but by the ever-watchful eyes of neighbors and the church alike. Gossip, suspicion, and public penance awaited any woman suspected of transgression. The stakes were high and the consequences severe. Confession became a ritual of both fear and relief. Women, taught from childhood to see their own desires as dangerous, carried secret burdens of guilt for thoughts and impulses they could neither control nor fully understand. The confessional booth was a place where they both sought absolution and face interrogation, a space where sins were named aloud, but judgment was never far behind. The priest, a man invested with spiritual authority, held power to forgive or condemn, to weigh the soul's purity and prescribe penance that often required public acts of humiliation or prolonged suffering. The church also imposed strict rules on women's behavior, governing dress, speech, and conduct with an unyielding hand. Modesty was commanded not merely as a matter of etiquette, but as a sacred duty, with veils and modest gowns covering hair and body, symbols of submission to divine order and protection from sinful thoughts. Women who deviated, whether by dressing too richly, speaking too boldly, or acting with too much independence, risked accusations of vanity, pride, or worse, witchcraft, a terrifying label that could lead to torture and death. Amid this spiritual control, many women found themselves caught between the church's lofty ideals and the harsh realities of daily life. Poverty, hunger, disease, and the relentless labor of childbirth often left them weary, broken, and far from perfection demanded by doctrine. Yet the church's message was clear. Suffering was a form of grace, a test of faith, a path to salvation, if borne with humility. This theology of suffering often silenced women's pain, encouraging them to accept hardship as God's will rather than question their lot. Despite this, women found ways to negotiate their spiritual lives within these confines. Some became nuns, retreating from the world to live under the church's protection and rules, finding in cloistered life a paradoxical freedom to learn, pray, and sometimes wield influence within their convent walls. Others cultivated personal devotions, saint stories, and private prayers that brought comfort and a sense of agency in an otherwise restrictive spiritual landscape. Yet for most, the grip of the church remained firm, shaping their self-perception and social standing. The ideal woman was a paradox, chaste but fruitful, silent but obedient, humble but dignified, present in body but absent in voice. The spiritual chains were invisible, yet as binding as iron, forged in sermons, rituals, and the collective gaze of society that saw women first as souls to be saved, and only second as people to be heard. This grip did not merely confine women's bodies and actions, but penetrated the very core of their identity, weaving a complex web of guilt and virtue that few could untangle. It created a world where women were taught to fear their own desires, to distrust their own thoughts, and to find their worth in the approval of a distant God mediated by earthly men. And so, beneath the towering spires and stained glass windows, in quiet parish churches and grand cathedrals alike, the female soul was shaped and shadowed by an institution that promised salvation but demanded silence. A salvation paid for in loss, sacrifice, and the constant weighing of sin and purity. The church's grip was neither gentle nor forgiving. It was relentless, pervasive, and impossible to escape. And yet, within this strict embrace, women endured, adapting, resisting quietly, finding moments of spiritual solace, and preserving the flickering light of their own humanity in a world that sought to extinguish it. In the shadowed corners of medieval villages and towns, beneath the creak of timbered roofs and the watchful eyes of neighbors, there lived a persistent fear, a fear that when the skies failed to weep, when the crops wilted, when children fell ill or cattle perished, the cause was not mere chance or nature's whim, but the deliberate malice of a woman, unseen yet deeply suspected. The medieval world was a place where uncertainty bred suspicion, and suspicion sought a scapegoat, and all too often, that scapegoat was a woman. The widow who lived alone by the edge of the forest, the healer who tended wounds with herbs, the outspoken girl who refused to bow to tradition in their fear and helplessness. Communities looked for an explanation, and they found it in accusations that could change a life or end it. The burden of blame weighed heaviest on those who existed on society's margins, women who by circumstance or character did not fit neatly into the accepted roles of obedient wife or dutiful mother. These women, often isolated by poverty, illness, or unconventional behavior, became easy targets for those seeking to explain misfortune or misdeeds. A failed harvest could be the work of a curse whispered under breath. A sudden illness might be the result of a spiteful spell cast from a jealous heart. The deaths of infants or the stillbirths of children could be attributed not to the harshness of life, but to dark magic wielded by a neighbor's hand. To accuse a woman was to give shape to the chaos, to grasp a control in a world full of uncertainties. It was also a way to channel anger, fear, and frustration away from powerful lords or cruel fate and onto someone who could be publicly punished. The accusations took many forms: witchcraft, maleficium, heresy, seduction, the devil, all labels carrying the weight of condemnation and dread. Once accused, a woman's fate was often sealed before the truth could be uncovered, as courts operated not on evidence but on suspicion, rumor, and the confessions wrung from pain and fear. The process of accusation was itself a brutal ritual. A woman might be summoned before the local magistrate or ecclesiastical court, surrounded by a crowd eager for spectacle and confirmation of their fears. Interrogations were harsh, often relying on leading questions, threats, and the promise of leniency for confession. Torture was not uncommon. The stretching of limbs, the pressing of thumbscrews, the dunking in water, all intended to extract admissions of guilt, no matter how false or coerced. Many women confessed simply to end the torment, their voices echoing with despair in cold stone chambers. Punishments were as severe as they were public. Women found guilty might be sentenced to imprisonment in dark dungeons, forced labor, banishment, or the cruel humiliation of stocks and pillories in the village square. The most feared penalty was death, by burning at the stake, hanging, or drowning, spectacles that drew crowds from miles around and served as warnings to others. These punishments were not only acts of cruelty but instruments of social control, reinforcing the power of the church and secular authorities, while terrifying those who might dare to stray from accepted norms. The tragic reality was that many innocent women suffered under these accusations. Women who healed with herbs, midwives who delivered babies, widows who managed their own land. These were often the ones targeted, their knowledge and independence seen as threats. Even a harsh word or a jealous glance could be twisted into evidence of malevolence. The community's fear created a climate where speaking out was dangerous, where silence might be survival, but guilt was assumed. Despite the terror, some women resisted. There are stories, faint and scattered, of courage, women who stood before judges, proclaiming their innocence with quiet dignity, healers who continued to tend the sick in secret, neighbors who risked their own standing to defend the accused. But these acts of defiance were rare and often met with harsher reprisals. This culture of accusation and condemnation cast a long shadow over medieval life, poisoning relationships and breeding mistrust. It underscored the precarious position of women, whose very existence could be twisted into a threat, whose knowledge and strength were feared as much as needed. The fear of the cursed woman became a weapon wielded to maintain order, to suppress dissent, and to enforce a rigid social hierarchy. In the quiet moments after the crowds dispersed and the fires burned low, the women who survived these trials carried scars far deep in the physical wounds. Scars of betrayal, isolation, and the relentless burden of suspicion. Their stories, often silenced or forgotten, remain a testament to the harsh realities faced by those trapped in the cruel machinery of medieval justice. And so, as the village settled back into its uneasy rhythm, the fear lingered, a ghost in the hearth, a shadow in the fields, reminding all who lived there that in a world ruled by faith and fear, a woman's voice could be her salvation or her undoing, and the line between innocence and guilt was as fragile and shifting as the flicker of candlelight. In the grim theater of medieval justice, where law was entwined with custom and fear, punishment was a spectacle, a tool not only to chastise but to terrify. It was a final act in a drama that had begun with suspicion, accusation, and trial, the moment when mercy was scarce and cruelty often reigned supreme. For women who stepped beyond the narrow lines drawn for them, who dared to challenge the roles assigned by birth and faith, the consequences were swift and unrelenting. Punishment was meted out not with kindness or understanding, but with a harshness that echoed through villages and towns, engraving lessons in blood and shame. Torture was the dark language of confession, the cruel dialogue in which bodies were instruments of pain and minds were broken to extract words that would justify the court's verdict. It was a merciless practice, designed to crush the spirit as much as the flesh. It was wielded disproportionately against women, whose perceived weakness was twisted into proof of guilt or devilry. Chains, racks, thumbscrews, and iron boots, each device a cruel invention, calibrated to inflict agony without immediate death, prolonging suffering until the victim yielded to the unbearable. The public nature of punishment was its own form of cruelty. Stocks and pillories were not merely places of confinement, but stages for humiliation. A woman bound in wooden restraints, exposed to the jeers and spit crowd, was made an example, her dignity stripped away like the clothes she might have been forced to wear. Passers-by threw rotten vegetables or stones, their laughter mingling with her cries, while children were warned not to follow her wicked path. Shame was not incidental. It was a deliberate weapon, a way to enforce conformity through fear-disgrace. For some, the punishment was death, a terrifying final sentence carried out with ritualized cruelty. Burning at the stake was reserved for those branded heretics or witches, a pyre built tall, so that flames would consume the body slowly, the smoke rising like a signal of divine wrath. Hanging was more common for crimes deemed lesser, yet still punishable by death. A grim end swung beneath a gallows where condemned's final gasps were heard by the assembled masses. Drowning, breaking on the wheel, or beheading were other brutal methods, each with its own terrifying symbolism and pain. The women subjected to such fates were often those already marginalized, widows without protection, healers whose knowledge was feared, women accused of defying male authority, or those caught in the tangled webs of local disputes. The punishments were not just about justice, but about control, about reminding all who watched that the boundaries of behavior were strict, and transgression would be met with merciless reprisal. The psychological torment was as profound as the physical pain. The anticipation of punishment, the public shaming, the isolation before execution. These were designed to break the will and erase the individual beneath layers of fear and obedience. Families were shamed alongside the accused, bearing the weight of scandal and loss, while neighbors whispered, eyes flickering with relief or dread that they might be next. Yet, even in the face of such cruelty, some women showed remarkable courage, meeting their fate with stoic silence or fierce defiance. Their stories, passed down in whispered legend or forgotten in dusty records, remind us of resilience in the darkest hours, a glimmer of humanity amid relentless suffering. Punishment without pity was not only a tool of medieval authority, but a mirror reflecting society's deepest fears, of disorder, of female agency, of voices raised against the status quo. It was a world where mercy was rare, and justice was often blind, deaf, and cruel. As the flames died down, the crowds dispersed, and the village returned to its uneasy routine, the echoes of these punishments lingered, silent warnings etched into the landscape of memory, shaping lives long after the stones were cold and the bodies gone. When a husband died in the Middle Ages, it was often said that a woman's world shifted beneath her feet, a change that was both freeing and fraught with peril, a crossing from one form of bondage to another. For years, she had been known as someone's wife, her identity tied tightly to the man who had claimed her by marriage and law. She had borne his name, his children, carried his burdens, and lived within parameters set by his presence. But with his passing, a widow stepped into a strange new existence, at once liberated from the immediate control of a husband's authority, yet thrust into a precarious position where protection and status could vanish overnight. The freedom that came with widowhood was not the kind sung in songs or dreamed in fantasies, but a cautious, wary kind of autonomy. A widow was no longer a wife, but she was no lord either. She might inherit property, lands, or livestock, but only if the laws, the customs, and the will of male relatives allowed. In many places, her rights were tenuous, dependent on the goodwill of sons, brothers, or distant cousins eager to reclaim what they saw as rightly theirs. The village whispered to widows who found themselves stripped of lands they had managed or forced to marry again to ensure control passed back into male hands. Yet, within these narrow confines, a widow could wield influence. She might run a household alone, oversee servants and tenants, make decisions about planting or trade, and handle the finances once kept in her husband's name. In some cases, especially among the lower classes, widows became small-scale businesswomen, selling goods at market, lending money, or managing estates for absent heirs. This independence was hard-won, born not of choice but necessity, shaped by a keen understanding that survival depended on sharp wit, careful negotiation, and the strength to withstand suspicion. But with freedom came vulnerability. A widow, no longer shielded by a husband's protection, became a target for exploitation, accusation, and even violence. She might be pressured into hasty remarriage, her desires ignored in favor of alliances or land claims. Some men saw widows as opportunities to gain property, to assert power, or simply possess a woman who was no longer guarded by male kin. The shadow of forced marriages loomed large, offering security in exchange for a loss of agency, repeating a cycle of obedience under new masters. The social isolation of widowhood could be profound. Where a wife's place was within the household and community, a widow might be pushed to the margins. Physically, socially, and emotionally, she could be viewed with suspicion, seen as a woman without a protector or a cause, vulnerable to rumors and blame. In some communities, widows were feared, thought to possess dangerous knowledge or powers gleaned from their time in mourning, their solitary status making them figures of gossip or superstition. The rituals of mourning were themselves a weighty burden. Widows were expected to wear simple, somber clothing for extended periods, sometimes years, signaling their status to all who saw them. Their movements were often restricted. Elaborate feasts and celebrations were forbidden. They were to demonstrate grief visibly and constantly. The social expectations were strict, leaving little room for personal grief or private healing. Mourning was as much a performance of the community as it was an expression of loss. In the quiet hours, a widow might wrestle with loneliness that was deeper than the absence of a husband. She faced a world that both pitted and shunned her, a landscape where old roles had vanished and new ones were uncertain. Her thoughts, once contained by marriage and motherhood, now wandered freely. Toward the past she could not change, the present she must navigate, and the future she dared not fully imagine. The village around her continued its relentless rhythms, its fields and fires demanding attention. Neighbors offered condolences, brief and measured, before life resumed its hard pace. Children grew, debts had to be paid, seasons turned. The widow bore her burden silently, balancing the precarious line between independence and isolation. And yet in her solitude, there was a quiet strength, a resilience shaped by years of labor, loss, and survival. A knowledge that though the world might see her as vulnerable, she carried within her capacity to endure, to adapt, and perhaps to find new forms of freedom hidden within the shadows of her changed life. In the vast, unyielding landscape of the Middle Ages, where life's fragile thread was pulled taut by seasons of uncertainty, famine, and unrelenting labor, the work of women formed a silent, ceaseless current beneath the surface of every village and household, an immense, uncounted ocean of effort that shaped daily survival, but flowed largely unseen and unpraised by those who reaped its fruits. Women's labor was woven to the fabric of medieval life so thoroughly that to imagine the rhythms of a village or manor without it would be to imagine a loom missing its warp or a wheel spinning without its axle, impossible and incomplete. Yet despite this essential role, their toil was rarely documented in the cold records of law or commerce, absent from the proud chronicles of kings and warriors, and seldom celebrated in song or story. It was work done quietly, often invisibly, with hands hardened by toil and hearts steady with unspoken endurance. The alewives, those women who transformed the simple act of brewing into a vital thread of community life, occupied a curious and precarious place in the medieval economy and society. Brewing ale was originally a domestic task, an extension of household duties alongside baking and cooking. Yet for many alewives, it became something more, a small, often fragile business that brought not only sustenance but social cohesion. Their dark, frothy brews were the common drink of villagers and travelers, consumed in the bustling warmth of taverns where news was exchanged, disputes aired, and bonds forged over shared mugs. These women tended their fires carefully, grinding malt and stirring great wooden vats with practiced hands while juggling the relentless demands of family and home. But their status was fragile. Aloes were subject to suspicion as much as appreciation, accused at times of watering down their brew to increase profits, or worse, of allowing taverns to become dens of illicit behavior, gambling, brawling, and secret gatherings deemed dangerous by local authorities. To survive, aloes had to balance generosity with vigilance, earning enough trust to keep their patrons returning, while constantly watching for the shadows of doubt cast by neighbors and officials alike. In a more intimate but no less critical realm, midwives held a role both revered and feared, walking a line between life and death that few others dared approach. Entrusted with the sacred responsibility of bringing new life into the world, midwives carried the deep wisdom of generations, herbal remedies for easing pain, rituals to protect mother and child, and profound understanding of the body's mysteries passed down not through books, but through hands-on experience and whispered counsel among women. Their presence at births was a quiet yet vital act of defiance against the harshness of the age, a tether to life amid the ever-present threat of mortality. Yet this role came with peril. Midwives were vulnerable to accusations of witchcraft or negligence, especially when death or deformity shadowed their deliveries. Without formal recognition or protection, their knowledge was as much a source of fear as of hope. They operated on the margins of society, healing and helping while navigating a world that could swiftly turn from gratitude to suspicion, a cruel reminder of the fragile balance women had to maintain between power and vulnerability. Beyond these roles, the daily labors of women were countless and varied. Spinners pulling thread from wool, weavers weaving cloth that clothed their families and neighbors, dairymaids milking goats and cows before dawn's first light, bakers kneading dough into bread that would feed hungry mouths through long winters, and cleaners scrubbing hearths and floors until stone gleamed faintly under the pale sun filtering through smoky windows. These tasks were the steady heartbeat of village life, often performed in the background with little fanfare or reward. Their value measured only by the absence of complaint, the quiet knowledge that without them, the fragile balance of survival would crumble. Women worked the fields alongside men during planting and harvest, their hands thickened by soil and sweat. Yet their contributions often went unmentioned, their names rarely recorded even as their bodies bore the scars of the season's relentless demands. Economically, women's labor was bound by custom and law that offered little protection or reward. Much of their work was informal, unpaid, or compensated with goods and favors rather than coin, reinforcing a cycle of economic insecurity that left them dependent on husbands or fathers, vulnerable to loss through widowhood or displacement. Guilds and trades were closed to most women, barring entry to formal economic power, restricting them to peripheral roles or informal markets that offered scant security or status. The fruits of their labor, milk, cloth, ale, were vital to the village economy, yet rarely their own to claim, reinforcing a system that valued their work only insofar as it supported the household or the lord's estate. Within the household, the demands were unrelenting and unending. Cooking meals that sustained long days, cleaning the endless dirt and soot from living spaces, spinning yarn by the fireside as children slept, caring for the sick and elderly. All these tasks filled hours and days without pause. Physical exhaustion was constant, manifest in cracked, callous hands, aching backs bent by repetitive motion, and spirits worn thin by the weight of responsibility. Yet societal expectations forbade complaint. To grumble was to risk censure, suspicion of laziness, or worse, accusations of ungratefulness. Women bore these burdens quietly, embodying the ideal of silent, dutiful labor that upheld the order of medieval life. In times of crisis, when famine thinned bodies and plague darkened skies, women's roles expanded yet again into healers, herbalists, and caregivers of the sick and dying. Their intimate knowledge of medicinal plants, poultices, and treatments was both essential and precarious, practiced in the shadows of male-dominated medical authorities who dismissed or outlawed their work as superstition or heresy. These women walked a narrow path, saving lives and comforting the suffering while risking accusation, isolation, and persecution. Despite this fraught existence, women's labor was also a source of community and resilience. Gathered around wells, hearths, and markets, they exchanged not only goods but stories, advice, and the threads of connection that held villages together. Their shared work forged bonds of mutual support that sustained families and communities through hardship, loss, and change. Their labor was a quiet force, unheralded, often invisible, but absolutely indispensable. This paradox, women as both essential and invisible, respected and marginalized, was woven deeply into the fabric of medieval life. Their work shaped the rhythms of survival and society alike, yet their names often went unspoken, their contributions erased by the very systems that depended on them. And so, the women labored on, their hands crafting life's fragile continuance even as their stories remained hidden, a vast and vital undercurrent flowing quietly beneath the grand narratives of history. Among the many paths laid before medieval women, whether marriage, widowhood, or unending labor, the convent stood as a peculiar crossroads, a place both feared and sought after, a refuge and a prison woven together beneath towering stone walls and beneath the endless rhythm of cloistered silence. To some families, it was a practical solution, a way to manage scarce resources by sending a daughter away from the relentless demands of the household and the grinding poverty of peasant life, sheltering her from the often brutal realities of marriage, from husbands who might be cruel or absent, from the ceaseless chores that bent backs and frayed spirits. But to the girls and women who found themselves behind those heavy oak doors, the convent was far from simple sanctuary. It was an enclosure as confining as any prison cell, a place where choice was surrendered and voice muffled beneath layers of obedience and ritual older than many kingdoms. The stone walls, cold and gray, rose like a barrier not only between the nuns and the outside world, but also between each woman and the self she might have been. The convent was a world set apart, a microcosm ruled by bells and silence, by prayer and work. Long before dawn, the tolling of iron bells would ripple through the thick air, cutting through the darkness like a summons from another realm. The nuns stirred from their sparse beds, rising in cold rooms warmed only by a single candle's flicker or the faint glow of a distant hearth. They moved with quiet purpose, robes brushing the stone floors, feet muffled in worn slippers, drawn to the chapel where chant and whispered prayer began the day. The hours stretched on, measuring the cadence of psalms and the steady scratch of quill on parchment. As some copied holy texts, their fingers stained with ink, others tended the gardens that fed their community, or labored over spinning wheels that wound fine thread from raw wool, the soft clatter, and were a lullaby of industry. But the life within those cloisters was far from gentle. Obedience was demanded, enforced with the quiet authority of the abbess, a woman both feared and revered, whose word was law. Speech was carefully rationed. Even the softest voice required permission. Silence was not merely spiritual discipline, but a means of control, shaping a world where emotions were buried beneath layers of piety and duty, where joy and despair alike were expressed only in the subtlest of gestures or the hidden glance. The nuns became shadows moving through their days, faces veiled or lowered, hands folded as if clasping a fragile thread of self barely holding together beneath the weight of ritual. The physical labor was relentless. Despite the air of sanctity, the nuns worked hard and often long hours, tending vegetable patches, washing endless linen stiff with sweat and dirt, brewing ale that sustained the order, repairing threadbare habits. Illness was common in such close quarters, exacerbated by poor diet and damp stone walls that seeped cold into bones. Yet medical care was scarce beyond prayers, and simple herbal remedies drawn from scant knowledge. Suffering was often endured silently, its weight carried alone beneath the surface of calm devotion. Within this cloistered life, loneliness wove its own cruel thread. Not the solitude of isolation, but a deeper exile of suppressed identity and muted yearning. Sisterhood offered companionship. Yet beneath the surface simmered tensions born of competition, jealousy, and the unyielding hierarchies that governed every interaction. Ambition found its place even here, tempered by the limits imposed by faith and order. Each nun's status was carefully measured. The abbess at the summit, followed by prioresses, then the novices. Young girls often sent here before they could understand what was asked of them, their futures shaped by decisions made far beyond their own voices. Families might have seen the convent as a pragmatic choice. No dowry to arrange, no marriage to negotiate, a daughter's labor given over to God rather than household. But for the girl who entered, this was a lifetime contract, a renunciation of worldly ties, of family, of the possibility of freedom or love beyond those stone walls. Letters home were closely monitored, visits scarce and brief. Life outside changed with the slow march of seasons, while the nuns remained locked in the unchanging cycles of prayer, work, and silence. Yet even within these strict confines, the convent could be a place of learning and influence. Some nuns became skilled scribes, illuminating manuscripts that survived centuries, their delicate hands bringing color and light to sacred texts. Others served as healers, tending the sick with knowledge passed down through generations, blending faith and herbal lore. Their prayers were thought powerful, their wisdom sought by those beyond the cloister's gates. Even as their worldly authority was tightly bounded, confined to a world of stained glass and carved wood, the paradox of convent life, simultaneously sanctuary and cage, defined the experience for these women caught between worlds. It was a place where identity was both discovered and lost, where silence was both worship and punishment, and where the price of piety was a lifetime of quiet surrender. As the bells tolled again and again, echoing down cold stone corridors, the nuns moved like ghosts through a world that both protected and confined them, a world where devotion was demanded, individuality erased, and the outside world faded to a distant murmur. Outside the convent walls, the world continued its brutal rhythms. Children were born, fields plowed, women married, widowed, labored, and survived. But inside, time folded in on itself, and the nunnery stood as a quiet prison for those who had entered seeking safety, yet found captivity instead. A stark monument to the complexities of womanhood in medieval times, where freedom and confinement dance an endless waltz beneath the watchful eyes of God and man. In the intricate tapestry of medieval life, woven tight with superstition, faith, and the slow churn of everyday survival, the shadow of witchcraft stretched long and dark, an ever-present specter, lurking in the corners of hearth and village, twisting itself around the hopes and fears of people who lived under the constant weight of uncertainty and hardship. It was a world where explanations for sudden tragedy, misfortune, or disease were scarce and often terrifying, where the unseen forces of the natural and supernatural collided in minds desperate to make sense of the inexplicable. For women especially, whose power was circumscribed by custom and law, the line between healer and heretic, between wise woman and witch, was as thin and fragile as a thread stretched across a loom, easily snapped by trembling hands in moments of fear and suspicion. The medieval village, cloaked in mist and silence at dawn, was a place where the unknown thrived, where cold winds carried whispers of death and decay, where fields could fail without warning, where a child's fever might rise and fall with no clear cause, and where the fragile balance between life and death was tested daily. In such a precarious existence, the human mind sought refuge in stories and rituals, in the idea that unseen forces were at play, forces that could be named, confronted, or expelled. And so, when misfortune struck, blame was often cast outward, searching for a face to wear the burden of evil, a scapegoat to carry the pain of loss and the fear of the unknown. Women who lived on the edges of society, widows, healers, those who spoke too freely or lived too independently, became easy targets for these dark suspicions. Their knowledge of herbs, once valued as vital medicine passed down through generations, began to be twisted into evidence of sorcery. The gentle art of healing was transformed into a dangerous craft, a secret pact with forces unseen and feared. Their very independence, the ways they moved through the world alone or with purpose, became signs of defiance and danger, raising eyes and whispers behind their backs. To be a woman outside the strict bounds of obedience was to invite scrutiny and danger. It often began with something small, a cow that refused to give milk, a harvest blighted by unseen blight, a neighbor's child who fell ill suddenly. Such tragedies, so common and so cruel, demanded explanation, and when the cause could not be found in the soil or the weather, it was found instead in the eyes of the woman who lived apart, who knew things others did not, who was whispered about in the dark. Gossip spread like wildfire through village streets, carried by nervous tongues and sharpened by fear, twisting truth into accusation. Old grudges, petty jealousies, the weight of envy or resentment, all found new life in the idea of the witch, the enemy within. When accusations arose, the accused rarely had a chance for justice. The courts, presided over by men steeped in religious authority and social power, accepted spectral evidence without question. Visions of spirits, dreams of curses, confessions wrung out through unimaginable torture. These confessions, forced from mouths cracked by pain and despair, became the unassailable proof that condemned women to death. The process was less about truth and more about enforcing a fearful order, a brutal mechanism to stamp out what was not understood or controlled. Trials were public spectacles, grim and terrifying. where the accused stood stripped of dignity before a jeering crowd and harsh judges, their pleas drowned beneath the chants of condemnation and prayers for divine judgment. Often, the condemned women died proclaiming their innocence, their voices swallowed by the thunder of accusation and the weight of centuries-old fears. The Church, wielding the terrifying machinery of the Inquisition, cast witches not only as enemies of the community, but as foes of God himself, sinners to be purged by fire and fear. The punishment was merciless. Execution by burning at the stake was as much symbolic as it was brutal. A fiery cleansing meant to purify the soul and warn the living. Villagers gathered in the square, the crackling flames illuminating the night as the accused's body was consumed, leaving behind only ash and silence where once had been flesh, spirit, and life. The fire was a dark ritual, a collective act of horror and control, designed to crush dissent and obedience alike. Beneath this horror lay a deeper tragedy. Many accused were women who had once served their communities as midwives, healers, wise women whose knowledge had preserved life and eased suffering. Their gifts became their curse, their independence their undoing in a world ruled by suspicion and fear. The witch hunts, far from being just isolated acts of cruelty, were instruments of control, tools to enforce conformity, silence women's power, and maintain the strict hierarchy of medieval society. Poor, widowed, elderly, or simply different women were swept up in the storm of accusation, victims of a system built on patriarchal authority and fear of the unknown. Yet even as the flames consumed their bodies, the legacy of these women endured, not in grand monuments or written history, but in the whispered stories passed down secretly among women, in the quiet remembrance of those who refused to let fear erase their memory. The image of the witch, shaped by centuries of myth and fear, became a symbol of female otherness, rebellion, and the terrifying power of knowledge kept in the shadows. For those who lived through the dark days of witch hunts, the threat of accusation was a constant, lingering shadow, a reminder that to speak, to heal, or to live freely could be deadly. And in the deepest quiet, when the village slept and the fire's dyed embers, women gathered in secret, sharing stories, songs, and memories of those lost to flames and fear, carrying forward the spirit of resistance in whispered voices and hidden prayers. Though fire claimed their bodies, it could never fully extinguish the strength beneath, a strength that flickered, faint but unbroken, waiting for a day when it might blaze anew. In the vast and often unforgiving shadows of medieval history, where the clang of swords, the pomp of kings, and the chronicled marches of armies fill the pages, there lies another story, quieter, softer, and far less told. The story of countless girls whose names were never written down, whose lives were lived beneath the weight of poverty and the demands of a world that measured their worth not by who they were, but by what they could provide or save. These were the forgotten daughters, the invisible lives that left no mark on parchment, no echo in the halls of power. Their footprints are mere whispers on dusty roads, faint impressions lost in records kept by men who cared little for the lives of girls whose faces have faded, erased by the slow passage of time and indifference. The moment a girl was born in the Middle Ages was often one filled not with celebration, but with quiet tension, a breath held somewhere between hope and dread, depending on the fortunes and fears of the family into which she came. In households barely able to feed themselves, where every mouth was a burden to be carried with strained backs and trembling hands, daughters were too often seen as liabilities rather than blessings. Sons strong and able-bodied, promised labor in the fields, heirs to the family name and legacy, future bearers of the land and tools. Daughters, in contrast, came with costs that weighed heavily, dowries to gather, garments to sew, and futures uncertain, bought and sold like goods at a market stall. Their worth was not in the beating of their hearts, but in the currency they might bring or the debt they might relieve. Because of this, many daughters disappeared long before they could leave a mark on the world. Their births might be noted, if at all, in a faded parish register, a scratch of ink on brittle parchment kept in some forgotten chest. Their lives were lived quietly, often in the corners of crowded cottages or under the eaves of great manor houses, where their names were replaced by labels like maid, child servant, or simply the girl. Death, when it came, as it so often did in those cruel years of famine, disease, and hardship, came quickly and without fanfare, leaving no record beyond a blank space or a whispered lament. There were no tombstones carved with loving epitaphs, no prayers offered by generations to come. Instead, These girls vanish into silence, their passing unnoticed or accepted as an unremarkable loss in a world too weary to mourn. For some, the fate was even harsher. In desperate times, when hunger gnawed relentlessly at the belly of the family and survival seemed a distant hope, daughters might be given away early, sent to live with distant relatives or strangers, as if handing over a burden that could no longer be borne. Others were thrust into servitude, their days consumed by endless chores in crowded kitchens, coal barns, or the shadowed halls of convents, where their youth was stolen and their names forgotten. With no property, no rights, and no voice in court or council, these daughters were shadows in their own lives, existing only to serve the needs of others and vanish when they no longer could. In the bleakest of circumstances, daughters were hidden or denied outright. Some families, racked by hunger and desperation, resorted to infanticide or abandonment, brutal acts born not of cruelty but of a terrifying hope for survival. Others concealed their daughters, ashamed or fearful of the burden they represented in a world that saw little value in their existence. Some girls were left to wither alone, forgotten even by those who should protect them, their fragile lives extinguished quietly in the cold, dark corners of the village. These were stories of absence, blank spaces in family trees, missing names in registers, echoes of cries that went unheard. For those daughters who survived beyond childhood, the future remained largely dictated by others. Marriage was rarely a choice, but a transaction arranged with convenience or advantage of families. A girl's name was often erased beneath that of her husband, her lineage folded away as if it mattered little compared to the male line. In documents and records, men were remembered, their deeds recorded. Women, if mentioned at all, were footnotes, initials, or passing references, their stories subsumed into the lives of husbands and fathers. The identity of a daughter was swallowed up by roles assigned, names given, and futures determined not by her will, but by the needs and designs of others. For poor and illegitimate daughters, the erasure was even deeper. Without fathers to claim them or dowries to offer, they drifted further to the margins, sold into servitude or confined to convents, their lives shaped by the need to survive rather than any notion of choice or freedom. They were questions left unanswered in the margins of history, silences that grew louder the more records tried to forget them. Yet in the face of such erasure, these forgotten daughters lived with complexity. They loved and mourned, worked and hoped, laughed and feared. They formed friendships and bonds, navigated childhood and the dangers of growing into womanhood with courage and resilience unseen by those who wrote history's grand narratives. Their presence lingered in the most subtle traces, a worn mitten found in the ashes of a hearth, a faded stitch on a well-used garment, a lullaby whispered across generations, carrying memory and comfort in its melody. Though history forgot their names, these daughters shaped the land they tilled, the homes they kept, the children they bore, and the very rhythm of village life. The quiet labor of their hands, the whispered prayers and untold stories, formed the hidden pulse beneath the louder tales of kings and battles. To remember these daughters is to confront the vast silences history holds, to give voice to lives not marked by wealth or power, but by endurance, love, and quiet strength. It is to honor those girls who lived in the spaces between the recorded deeds, whose stories are fragments and shadows, but no less real. And in this remembrance lies a subtle rebellion, a reclaiming of presence, worth, and humanity for those long forgotten, a soft but resolute echo across the centuries that insists they were here, that they mattered, that their stories, though unwritten, are not lost. In the vast tapestry of medieval life, woven tight with the threads of duty, obedience, and silence, there flickered within the quiet corners of villages and homes a series of subtle, almost invisible rebellions, delicate acts of defiance that did not thunder in public squares nor draw the eye of lords or priests, but whispered softly, like candle flames dancing in the breathless dark. For women whose voices were often denied by law and custom, whose bodies and choices were tightly bound by the hands of fathers, husbands, and lords, power was rarely found in grand proclamations or open revolt. Instead, it lived in the minute, the hidden, the everyday. In a glance held just a moment too long, a single word softly spoken beneath the din of expectation, a quiet moment of care given despite command, a small choice made within the narrow confines allowed. The world that these women inhabited was one that demanded strict compliance, where their roles were not theirs to choose and their bodies and labor were claimed, assigned, and often owned by others, first by the authority of their fathers, then their husbands, then the lords who governed their lands. Yet even within these iron boundaries, women found ways to assert their will, to carve out spaces of autonomy, however fleeting and fragile those spaces might be. These acts of resistance were never about overturning kingdoms or leading armies into battle, but rather about surviving day by day, preserving dignity in the face of erasure, safeguarding their own sense of self when the world told them they were little more than property or background. Sometimes resistance was found in silence itself, a refusal to speak the expected words, to offer the dutiful answer rehearsed over years, to agree without thought or feeling. This silence was a language of its own, a quiet hold of secrets and stories told only in hushed tones to trusted women in the privacy of kitchens or in the sheltering shade of fields. Knowledge was passed down through generations like a fragile flame, carefully shielded from the harsh winds of judgment and control. In a world where speech could bring punishment or scorn, silence could also be a potent form of strength, a way to protect self and family when words might otherwise bring ruin. Other times, resistance was woven delicately into the very fabric of daily life, where the seemingly mundane became a subtle battleground for will and selfhood. A woman might slow her work just enough to remind those around her that she was not an automaton, that her body and spirit had limits, that she could choose when and how to give her strength. She might refuse a second helping at the meal, signaling displeasure or asserting choice without a single spoken protest. A sharp glance, a well-timed sigh, or a carefully placed silence could communicate more than any shouted outcry, conveying defiance beneath the surface, an unspoken assertion of presence and will. Within the household, where women manage the unseen labor of maintaining homes and families, they found ways to influence decisions through means often unnoticed by the men who thought themselves in control, choosing which foods to prepare, whose favors to seek among servants or neighbors, which stories to tell to fire to sway opinion. These acts were diplomacy played in the shadows. A carefully crafted letter slipped into a lord's hands, a whispered counsel given to a son or servant at just the right moment, could change the course of events without ever rising to the level of public confrontation. Such quiet power required subtlety, patience, and deep understanding of the social currents swirling invisibly through their world. Resistance also took shape in the preservation of tradition and memory. Women kept alive old songs, prayers, and tales that did not align neatly with the official teachings of the church or the edicts of local lords. They tended to the knowledge of herbs and remedies, both healing and harmful, secrets passed from mother to daughter, a silent defiance against the sometimes cruel grip of formal authority. They recalled stories of saints and witches alike, lessons learned from hardship, hope, and survival, maintaining a cultural thread that bound communities together in ways written laws never could. In safeguarding these stories and traditions, they resisted erasure and asserted the continuity of their own humanity and wisdom. There were moments when resistance became physical, though rarely violent or overt. A refusal to obey a harsh or unjust order, a secret act of kindness toward a punished child, the sharing of food or clothing with a neighbor in need despite scarcity. These small gestures rippled outward quietly, challenging authority and asserting a fragile but vital humanity within systems designed to suppress it. Even when such acts brought punishment or hardship, they did not cease. Instead, they wove a fabric of quiet rebellion that could not be entirely unraveled or erased. It was in these acts that women declared, without words, their unbroken will live and care despite the world's cruelty. At times, a woman's very survival itself was an act of resistance, to endure endless labor, injuries, losses, and pain. To continue living and caring despite exhaustion and despair was to assert a will that could not be broken by the harshness imposed upon her. In simply surviving, she defied the fate others sought to impose, claiming her existence as her own, even if only in the silent chambers of her heart, a secret flame that no one could snuff out. And so, these small gestures and quiet rebellions accumulated over lifetimes and generations, forming a hidden history of women's strength and resilience, not recorded in grand tomes or sung by bards in great halls, but alive in the lived experience of countless generations, whispered in kitchens warmed by firelight, carried on a breath of winds through fields touched by the rising sun, and preserved in prayers uttered softly beneath heavy skies. Women resisted, not with swords or banners, but with hands that worked tirelessly, voices that whispered carefully, and spirits that endured with quiet, steadfast courage. Within this quiet resistance, there was always hope. The hope that one day those small flames might grow into a fire that could not be ignored, that the silence might be heard, that the hidden might come into light. Until then, these acts remained secret, small, and sacred, a testament to the power found in the most unexpected places, the softest voices, and the unseen corners of a world that so often refused to listen. Within the relentless turning of the seasons, beneath skies that bore witness to countless hardships and fleeting joys alike, there lived women whose names might never be recorded in dusty tomes or inscribed on stone, but whose influence reached far beyond the walls of their humble cottages. These were the mothers of the medieval world. Quiet, resilient figures whose lives unfolded in the spaces between history's grand narratives. They bore the weight of a world that demanded much and offered little. Yet through their steadfast love and unwavering care, they shaped the course of countless lives and in ways unseen, the very fabric of the future itself. Motherhood in this harsh era was no gentle calling. It was a burdensome, often brutal existence marked by ceaseless labor, wrenching loss, and the constant threat of sorrow. To carry life within her body was to face danger with every breath, knowing that childbirth could steal her strength or her very life in a matter of hours. To raise children was to face a world fraught with famine, disease, and the unyielding grip of poverty. Yet within this landscape of hardship, motherhood was also a source of profound purpose and quiet power, a force that extended beyond the mere survival of flesh and blood. In the dim, smoky glow of the hearth, where shadows danced on rough-hewn walls and the night settled thick and silent, mothers became the first teachers and storytellers. Their voices, low and soothing, wove tales that carried more than simple entertainment. They told of saints who endured suffering with grace, heroes who rose despite despair, and ancestors whose spirits lingered in the earth and sky. These stories, spoken softly into small ears, were rich with coded wisdom, lessons hidden beneath layers of metaphor and song, a secret language passed from mother to child, intended to nurture resilience, hope, and a sense of belonging in a world that often sought to diminish the worth of women. Beyond stories, mothers shared practical knowledge born of experience and necessity. They taught how to mend a garment torn by daily toil, how to read the subtle signs in the wind or the shape of clouds that foretold storms, and how to recognize which herbs could heal and which could harm. These lessons were not found in books, for books were rare and often reserved for men. Rather, they were handed down through generations by the touch of a patient hand or the quiet repetition of a song, safeguarding vital knowledge that helped families survive. Through these acts of teaching and nurturing, mothers preserved culture and tradition, creating a lineage of strength passed quietly from one child to the next. But motherhood was not only a time of teaching and nurturing. It was also a time of bearing witness to the cruel realities of medieval life. Mothers stood beside their children through illness that no healer could cure, through years of famine that shriveled crops and stomachs alike, and through the harsh judgments of society that offered little mercy to the weak. They held trembling hands, whispered prayers in the dark, and braced themselves against the grief of loss that came too often and too swiftly. In those moments, they became keepers of hope, fragile, yes, but fiercely protected, holding on to belief that despite suffering, there might be a future that looked kinder, that promised more than mere endurance. As daughters grew to womanhood, mothers prepared them for the roles they too would inherit. They passed on not only skills and stories, but also warnings and quiet counsel, lessons in obedience and survival, but also in the subtle art of resistance and self-preservation. These teachings were not shouted from rooftops, but conveyed in whispered conversations at the edge of firelight, in knowing glances shared while fetching water, in the gentle tightening of a hand when harsh words were spoken elsewhere. Mothers equipped their daughters not just to obey the roles society demanded, but to carry within them the quiet strength to endure, to protect, and to someday nurture change. Sometimes, a mother's influence reached beyond her own family. She might join other women in hidden corners at the well, in the forest edge, or in the shadowed alcoves of village churchyard, where stories, wisdom, and encouragement were exchanged in secret circles. These gatherings, fragile and fleeting as they were, formed invisible networks of solidarity and survival. In these moments, the shared burdens of motherhood and womanhood were made lighter through companionship, and the courage to carry on was renewed. It was here, in these soft-spoken alliances that the seeds of community and resilience were sown, binding women together in a collective strength that no lord or law could easily break. Though the world demanded silence from them, mothers found ways to speak, not always in words, but in the language of touch and care, in the rhythm of daily tasks performed with love and precision. A brush of hair from a child's face, the steady rocking of cradle, the weaving of a basket, or the careful stitching of a hem. These acts were messages of presence, affirmation, and protection. Each gesture carried the weight of a quiet revolution, a steadfast refusal to let despair claim the future. Through their nurturing, mothers passed on not only life itself, but also a profound message that even in the face of hardship, even when power was denied, love and hope could endure. And so, while the grand histories tell of kings and battles, conquests and crowns, it is within the humble lives of mothers that the true pulse of the past beats strongest. Their stories may be whispered and shadowed, but they resonate still, echoing across centuries in the hearts of those who listen with patience and care. Because mothers were never silent. Truly, they spoke with every embrace, every lesson, every song sung into the night. And through these acts of steadfast love, the world was slowly, inexorably changed. In this understanding, as you drift toward sleep, imagine the countless hands that rocked cradles, mended clothes, and passed on stories beneath flickering candlelight. Feel the warmth of their love, the depth of their courage, and the enduring strength of their spirits, quietly shaping the world even in the darkest times. And rest in the knowledge that these unseen architects of resilience still watch over us, their echoes soft but unbroken, a lullaby that carries us gently into the night. As centuries pass, the great stone castles crumble into dust, the wooden beams of humble cottages rot away, and the names carved into ancient ledgers fade from memory. The lives of those ordinary medieval women, the wives, the mothers, the laborers, linger quietly beneath the surface of history, like faint echoes carried on a distant wind, barely audible, yet impossibly persistent. Their voices, often drowned beneath the grand tales of kings and battles, have never truly disappeared. They persist in the spaces between the pages, in the shadows of forgotten corners, in the quiet thrum of everyday life that has stretched through generations and continues even now. The women who bent their backs through endless seasons of toil, who bore children into a world as harsh as it was unforgiving, who lived bound by silence and expectation, were the invisible backbone of their communities. Their suffering was not marked by dramatic upheaval or heroic clashes, but by an unyielding, steady endurance that required a strength far deeper and more enduring than any sword could wield. It was a slow, grinding pain, physical, emotional, and spiritual, worn like a cloak woven from countless days of labor and nights of quiet sacrifice. These were not lives chronicled in illuminated manuscripts or heralded in song, but they were no less significant, for in their quiet suffering, they kept the world turning. They fed the hungry mouths, tended the sick and the old, nurtured the children, and sustained the land. They were the keepers of homes and hearths, the guardians of lineage and memory. In their hands, the fragile threads of survival were knotted tightly, so tightly that no storm could unravel them easily. Though shackled by laws that denied them voice and choice, these women found ways to speak and to shape the world, often without words. A glance exchanged at the well, a gentle touch on a child's arm, a carefully folded cloth, a whispered story in the dark. These were their languages. And in these quiet acts, they preserved culture, passed on wisdom, and sowed the seeds of change that would one day sprout into new possibilities. Their endurance is a reminder that history is not only made by the loud and the powerful, but also by the soft and the unseen. It calls us to listen not just to chroniclers of war and conquest, but to the murmurs of those who lived ordinary, extraordinary lives behind closed doors, beneath thatched roofs, and beside flickering fires. Their stories invite us to honor the invisible labors that sustain humanity, the endless work, the silent sacrifices, the small mercies offered in shadow and silence. And even now, as we drift through modern lives filled with noise and distraction, the echoes of their courage ripple beneath us. In every quiet act of kindness, in every moment of resilience, in every effort to be heard, where voices have been silenced before, their legacy endures. It hums softly through generations, a gentle but unwavering reminder of the cost of silence and the power of perseverance. So as you close your eyes and feel your breath slow and deepen, imagine the countless women who came before, their hands weathered but steady, their eyes full of stories untold. Feel the weight of their courage, the depth of their love, the quiet strength of their enduring spirits, and rest in the knowledge that their lives, their struggles, and their silent triumphs still matter, that even in silence, they continue to speak and we continue to listen. And with that gentle thought, may your mind find peace and your heart a soft place to rest.